Hi, I'm Rachel Evans, Metadata Services and Special Collections Librarian at the University of Georgia School of Law and Library. Thank you so much, SEALL, for having me present my virtual poster today. It is titled Unlocking the Archives, Leveraging Grants, Digitization, Consortia OAI Harvesting, Digital Exhibits, and PR Campaigns that Spotlight Special Collections. I am going to present to you all of the things that I've learned as a part of this poster for the past 3 years of UGA Law Library's digitization grant funding. We have received several grants and we've applied to more than we've received. So again, this poster pulls on the experience of all of those efforts. Our awarded grants that this gathers information from and shares our experiences from include a subgrant of services from the Digital Library of Georgia. That project took place last year and it is fully available for you to explore online now. It digitized more than 500 photographs from historical events that took place at the School of Law. Many of those were lectures and presentations, commencement speeches, featuring some prominent legal figures and political figures as well. So the likes of those include Jimmy Carter, Sam Nunn. We also have Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's a lot of big names that are represented throughout the years ranging from the 70s to the late 90s in that collection. And now we have images to put with our event records, including programs and other wonderful items. Next, we will also be sharing some information that's related to our work with the National Project Grant we received from the Legal Information Preservation Alliance. That one also took place last year. It's a small digitization grant that we were able to use to digitize 9 historic treatises. And some of those items were in deteriorating condition. So digitizing them makes them available without risking damage to the items if people were to visit in person. They are also fully in the public domain as our photographs were. And it's wonderful that we could make those available. It starts a small collection, so there's only 9, but we hope to sort of piecemeal that with future grant efforts and continue to build that collection. Both of these collections live in our institutional repository in our law library and archives section. And then the final one that I'm going to touch on a little bit throughout this poster, just gathering the information and the lessons we've learned and how we have made these grants possible, is the Georgia Historical Records Advisory Council. That is a grant that we have just received last fall, and we're still in the grant cycle for fulfilling that one. It will digitize over 140 audio and video recordings on VHS and audio cassette tapes. And those actually complement many of the photographs that we digitized with the Digital Library of Georgia. And that will make speeches from that collection for our commencement and law day and many other named lecture series that have gone on for decades and decades. It will make full streaming available for the audio and in many cases video as well. And we had one-off to digitize many of those items. The ones that were digitized were in MP3 formats. And so even the discs that those are on are now deteriorating. And so how to handle these obsolete formats in a way that not just makes them presentable and useful without damaging the further deteriorating items on those obsolete formats. It also makes them discoverable and accessible to people all over the world. So I'm going to share with you today this poster. Step 1, if you have ideas and things in your library's collection or your organization's collection that you think would be a good fit for funding, identifying the right funding, the right opportunity, sometimes that can be the hardest part. So the following steps have really helped us as we've gone through this process. Take advantage of the funding org's consultations. We have tried to do this every single time, and the ones where we took more advantage of their free consultations in advance of submitting our application really helped and made it strong stronger. And those are the ones that we ended up getting awarded for. I would also say be sure to look at and even begin drafting your grant application and narratives from other awarded narratives. Most of the organizations are really good about putting examples that are full applications and narratives that have been awarded up on their website. So you can start from there. You can look at how someone else mapped out their timeline, how they described different sections of the narrative, and how they described the staff that may be working on it, and definitely use that sort of as a template for getting your own started. Ensure that your collection matches the organization's stakeholders. So this gets to that end user. If you're going to ask an organization to fund a project, make sure it's going to be of interest to them. Even if you know it should be of interest to them and it would be useful to the end user, you're going to need to describe that in detail and really match the specific items in the collection with use cases for different types of users. Your support letters can also really help with that. So having strong support letters is another thing you really want to think about. And in many cases, when we drafted one version of a grant application and it was rejected, we would turn around and try to get an even stronger support letter the second time. So for our Digital Library of Georgia support, our subgrant for that, our original support letter was actually one of our law faculty who was very prominent to us. We knew that they carried a lot of weight in the legal community and sort of historical research and that sort of thing. But to the granting organization, it was not an individual they knew, and it was not a specific use case where the support letter writer had actually used the items. So the second time around, when it was actually funded, we got a support letter from a librarian who is also at the University of Georgia, but not in our own library, who had an actual reference request where they had asked and needed access to an item that was not yet digitized. And so if these items had been digitized, they would have been able to access it on their own without necessarily putting in a reference request from us. They could have fulfilled their own request much faster, and they were able to describe in detail why their end users would benefit a real use case from these items being digitized. I would also say make sure you have a great proofreader. That's very important. It helps if your proofreader has nothing else to do with the project. You want them to have the viewpoint of the end review, the reviewer, the reviewer at the organization who's going to be reading through the applications. Pretend that they know nothing about the project. So it really helps if they are not one of the grant writers or someone working on the project, but that they are a completely unbiased party that has no knowledge of what's happening, and they'll really be able to give you a good opinion about it. I would also say only ask for what you can handle. Make sure you map out a good timeline. These are all really important steps when securing funding to make sure that if you are awarded it, will you be able to fulfill it? So that brings us to number 2, grant cycle fulfillment. Planning accordingly in advance, as I was saying, that will make it so much more feasible for you to prioritize your grant fulfillment deadlines and make sure you can meet them. If you don't meet your deadlines, it's highly possible that that will lead to future failures and not getting rewarded or awarded with future opportunities for funding. Contact your vendor as soon as you are awarded this. Sometimes there can be little lacks and gaps in communication between those that worked to secure the funding and those that will actually be working on the project. So no matter what part of the puzzle you are on your team, make sure that as soon as you're awarded something, you reach back out to that vendor that you got the estimate from, whoever you're going to be using to do digitization, and get all the materials you need and make sure you are on their schedule. Number 3, building relationships. Like so many things in life, it takes a village. Fulfilling major projects is no different. So even with smaller digitization projects like our LIPA grant for just 9 historical treatises, that turned out to be very time consuming because it was still our first grant digitization project that I had personally worked on. And so creating the documentation and the procedures, that was actually a big lift, even though it was a very small scale project. Now that we have that set up, it made it so much easier when we got around to doing our 500 photographs, which was a lot more items, a lot more metadata, a lot more building of sort of infrastructure to get that up and running and to publicize it. But since we already had some of the pieces in place, it was actually no different as far as our timeline went than the 9 historical treatises. So just make sure you use each grant opportunity to continue to expand your network of resources, document everything as you go, keep track of your procedures, especially if you're creating new ones as you go through this process. And I would also say, again, utilize any expert consultations for all the steps of the process. Ask your vendors for questions too. Sometimes they can actually provide some of that expert feedback that you need. If you're uncertain about how to fill out their form, just be honest. Like, this is my first time. What do you need from me? What level of detail? And that sort of thing. And often I end up passing that paperwork back and forth with them a few times before I get it just right to make sure that we're going to get the end product that we really want out of this. Next is resource sharing. One positive outgrowth of our situation and the folks that we have used has been resource sharing on a perpetual basis. So we've been able to do that with our relationship and partnership with the Digital Library of Georgia. We were able to identify them as not just a local and statewide partner, but they take part in the Digital Library Consortia, so the Digital Public Library of America. And that means that our records, whether they do the digitizing and we're funded with them or not, now that we have a relationship with them, we are on an ongoing quarterly basis to do OAI harvesting, which means they will pull metadata records from our repository for any collections that they are already keeping an eye on every quarter. And those records get passed on not just to their organization and their website so that their users can find them, but up the chain to the Digital Public Library of America so that any resources and records that we have that have more of that national reach will be discoverable at the Digital Public Library of America as well. And these resources are used by huge communities that aren't necessarily related to the legal or law academic environment that we would normally be reaching out to those community, to that immediate community. So this is thinking bigger, more national and global scale as far as the discoverability of your records and your items and your collections. So make sure if that's something that you have in mind, I encourage you to look at the Digital Public Library of America's metadata standards. They're pretty basic. As long as you're Dublin Core compliant, and most of our repository platforms, the one we use is Digital Commons, they do have that framework already set up for your metadata fields to very easily be moved over and reformatted to Dublin Core. You also want to research your hosting platform's OAI harvesting and what that will look like as far as reformatting your links. Again, these are just the plain unformatted metadata for your items and for your repository. So you can provide other institutions an outgoing link from your series that's totally unformatted, and you can do that on a site-wide, a series-wide, a collection, or an item level format so that it will pull metadata for one thing based on a date range or based on the series that you want them to harvest from. Number 5 is strategizing for users. Part of most grant applications, no matter how big or small the funding project is to illustrate your narrative and timeline and how you plan to finish your public collections and connect it to the end user. So how are they going to find out about it? How are they going to discover it? This can really help by identifying the users first and then mapping that discovery path across the web. So these are just some ideas. Try to think outside the box. Granting and digitization grant funding organizations are really going to be looking for users that are on a bigger scale than just your immediate community. And this can be difficult for our law library minds to kind of grasp. So we got to think outside the box, like K through 12 students and teachers. That's a big public open access educational and research source group of users. So anything that you have in your collections that may be very broad, think about your state's standards, and that can really help. The general public historical or genealogical sort of researcher that would just be the everyday person, right? That may be looking for a grandparent or a great grandparent or whatever their random research interest is. And then lastly, especially if you're going for really big funding for a big collection and you really want to go for something historical that's going to have a lot of impact, this is what we were after with digitizing the official annotated code of Georgia. And we have not been successful in that funding yet, but we're going to keep at it. And so something like the National Endowment for the Humanities, that would be where they are really looking for like interdisciplinary research connections to be made in your narrative. And they are also really looking for comparative research. So they want something that's got the biggest impact. Now, doing like sort of state by state comparisons of historical laws is a really good strategy to take with that. So I encourage you to just kind of think outside the box for your users. Next, it's going to be measuring impact. If you're sharing records with a consortia like we are doing with the Digital Library of Georgia and the Digital Public Library of America, it can get a little complicated. So often when a granting organization is going to give you funding for digitization, there's sometimes, as a part of that grant agreement, an ability for them to host the digitized files. Now, if you're a teeny tiny organization or a little historical society or something, and your collections are small and you don't have a lot of infrastructure or platforms that you yourself are going to manage and administer, that might be the route you want to take, right? But at the University of Georgia Law Library, as I've already said, we use Digital Commons, and we do have a pretty substantial collection already. We have the infrastructure and the staff to maintain hosting our own files. And so I really encourage you that if possible, that you host your own files. This is separate from sharing the metadata records and all the metadata being discoverable through the harvesting in other platforms. But just hosting your own files, that means that even if someone discovers the record of one of our items at the Digital Library of Georgia, and they click on it and they get to the point of trying to access a photograph or an audio recording or a historical treatise, they will be able to access that item by going back to our site. And that means that ultimately we have a single location where we can track usage and downloads and all sorts of great statistics so that we could actually measure and assess how impactful this collection has been. So I encourage you to maintain the hosting of your own digitized files whenever possible. And then lastly, publicizing the project. There are a lot of traditional and creative ways to publicize your final collection. Capitalize on the fact that these newly digitized items are more discoverable and more accessible than ever. Aim for items that have never had that level of access before, because that's going to just kind of do the work for you as far as publicizing it goes. We have made an attempt to digitize not just items for rights purposes. That makes it, of course, easier to get the digitization done when they are open access, but that we provide like that level of full open access. That's sort of a goal of ours. So it's not just about discoverability and accessibility, but sort of the reuse of that, especially for educational purposes. So I encourage you to leverage the following ways. These are just some of the ideas that we've used to spread the word about our successful funding and digitization. We've used newsletter pieces, writing articles to highlight the project itself and to share what we've done. That's a sort of a natural fit for sharing about something new. Press releases, sometimes your institution or even the funding organization will have its own newsletter or its own PR person who will help to craft those press releases for you and share it to the right groups. Blog posts are always great. Listservs, we've shared about a few of our efforts in places like My Communities through AALL. I would also encourage you to build a digital exhibit if you aren't used to doing that. Since this session is sort of bigger picture about all of this, I would still encourage you to check out our digital exhibits. We use Digital Commons, as I've said a few times, but Digital Commons now has the DCX platform. So it's very new, it's very easy to use, and it can be fun from the end user perspective to have a more exhibit look and feel, and it pulls items from your Digital Commons records. So it makes that part of getting the metadata and the photos and all those things any file attachments into the exhibit for you is very seamless. Any social media platforms your library has, obviously, and sometimes, again, the funding organization or any consortia you might be working with to share records, they're going to have an interest in sharing this too. And so they may be able to leverage that and publicize for you, or at least on your behalf and in tandem with you. We've done some virtual tour stories. If we did a companion physical exhibit for a digital exhibit or other items, that can work really well to just have a very short thing that introduces it, and it can be eye-catching and give you a little bit of a different type of content to share. And then lastly, I would say present about it as much as you can, just like I'm doing today. If you have any questions about any of this, I encourage you to reach out to me. Thanks again for having me, SEAALL. You can contact me at rsevans@uga.edu. And I encourage you to check out the virtual poster. As the poster, like I said, I'll try to make that available through the conference website. And also to check out all of our digital exhibits. You can find our exhibits at digitalcommons.law.uga.edu/exhibit. You can also find these different collections at digitalcommons.law.uga.edu, and you can navigate through our library to locate the historical treatises, since that is a library-specific collection. You can also navigate to our digitization photographs from the project that I mentioned several times with the Digital Library of Georgia by going to our Digital Commons homepage and searching for archives, and then School of Law photograph archives. And most of these that were done with this project are from the lectures and presentation series. Thanks again for having me. And again, reach out with any questions.